Well, in this coming 15-20 minutes, we will see. Uh, Muthu, can you mute Dev Mallu? I think he's driving.
No. I am available now. Please.
Okay, 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 done. Okay, so the whole talk will be on what are the summary of LHRH agonists, antagonists, and prostate cancer. So, so we all know this natural trend of prostate cancer from local disease to androgen sensitive to androgen resistant disease, where we have multiple agents intervening from non-metastatic to metastatic, asymptomatic to symptomatic. So when you come to the risk stratification as such, we have low risk, intermediate risk, and high risk when we take localized disease. And then if you take the if you take the localized disease, basically low risk is where you have a 2T28 disease and below. That is less than half of the lobe has to be involved, the PSA to be less than 10, and the Gleason should be less than 7. This is basically low risk. Intermediate risk is where T2B, that is more than half of the lobe has to be involved, and the PSA is between 10 to 20, and Gleason's is 7. And the high risk is above. So, well, if we look into the high risk category, we have something called favorable high risk and unfavorable high risk. So, if you look into favorable high risk is Gleason's 3+4, and unfavorable high risk is Gleason's 4+3. So this sort of subtle division happens with intermediate risk, unfavorable versus favorable, and there is a lot of treatment also we change depending on whether it is favorable or unfavorable. If it is unfavorable, we should give adjuvant androgen deprivation therapy for at least 6 months. So Dr. Demalio, can you just say what is this Gleason's all about? What is this 3+4 and 4+3, and so why this subtle difference also has a lot of impact on adjuvant androgen therapy? Dr. Demalio, you're there? Hello. Okay, so well, if you,
Hello. Hello.
yeah, Demalio, yeah, you can pitch in and give a few words on Gleason's.
Yeah. See, basically the Gleason's is a pattern of the microscopic tumor pattern. So
Okay,
Gleason 1 means when the neoplastic or the malignant acini or the glands, they are very close to each other in a very well circumscribed nodules.
okay,
Gleason 2 means they are just start infiltrating in the surrounding prostate stroma. 3 means they are more infiltrating. Gleason 4 means the infiltrating gland now fuse to each other, and this is known as the cribiform pattern. And Gleason 5 means there are no more glands, they are basically a single cell infiltration. Now, in the Gleason scoring, we use the primary pattern and the secondary pattern, and combined we give as a Gleason score. Now, see, 4+3 means there is the predominantly the glands or acini, they are fused to each other, and 3+4 means they are the predominant pattern is infiltrating, not fused to each other. Now, see, the
okay,
Gleason is the one of the most important and strong predictor of the survival and metastasis to the distant organs that all know. And the basic biology behind is very interesting. Now, see, we can in a molecular basis we can divide the prostate cancer grossly in a two group. So, one group of prostate cancer who have the fusion of a ETS family of gene, like your ERG, ETB1, ETB5, with a typical androgen regulated prostate cancer associated gene known as the TMPRS2. Now, the thing is that these fusion positive prostate cancer and fusion negative prostate cancer are biologically totally different. There is a difference in the future metastasis, the biochemical recurrence, and the positive and the extraprostatic extension. Now, the fusion positive, this typical ETS family fusion positive with the TMPRSS2 positive prostate cancers, if we see the microscopic region morphology, these prostate cancer basically are the cribiforming pattern. They have the prominent micronucleoli. They have the IDCP appearance, intrarectal carcinoma prostate appearance, and there is a chance of the extensive PNI. So that means that when there is a cribiforming architecture pattern, these prostate cancers are basically this typical transcription positive, this fusion positive cancer. So that's why the more 4+ pattern means there is a maximum the tumor clones are are positive for these typical fusions. That's why they are biologically aggressive. And the same thing, and similarly, they are also responsive to the androgen deprivations, because one of these fusion partner gene, TMPRSS2, they are basically androgen regulated genes. So that is the main biological hint or biological explanations of the difference between the behavior and difference between the clinical presentations of 4+3 and 3+4 prostate cancer. Any?
Excellent.
Hello?
So 3+4 and 4+ is not a morphology only; it's a biological difference. So that is
Yes,
basically,
it is
and its
definitely
sensitivity,
it is a
and its
morphology difference.
sensitivity to androgen deprivation.
Yes, it is
Excellent.
definitely morphology difference, but behind the morphology, there are this biological story also. So that's why there is a change in the clinical outcome. That's why there is a change in the treatment. There is androgen, more androgen is important here. Androgen deprivation therapy is important. That's all.
Excellent. So that was a very enlightening talk. Maybe that is the take-home message we need to have after the seminar. Then, so we, as medical oncologists, are not aware of the subtle differences of 3+4 and 4+3, and it's a morphological difference and also a biological difference where the androgen sensitivity and aggressiveness changes as per the Gleason score. So that's the reason
And
why.
one thing I just want to add, that these typical fusion positive and fusion negative cancer, there is no statistical significance in the tumor size, in the pathological pathological grade, or what I say, the surgical the grading. The difference is basically on this, the creamy-forming pattern present or not. So that's why the big tumors or the small tumors, there's no difference in these typical fusions. The small tumors can have these fusions. They may be the biologically more aggressive than a large size tumors. Okay, so that is also very interesting here.
Excellent. So that's very interesting, and in fact, we shouldn't ignore the Gleason's report, whether it is 3+4 and add it as 7, 4+3 is also 7. So it's not the addition; it is a heaven and hell difference in management, in outcomes, in biology, in morphology. So that is what it means. So so thanks a lot, Dr. Dev for you coming in and your busy schedule and giving us time. So that's about the morphology of intermediate risk. So low risk, we know how to treat. Intermediate risk, again, we divide into low and favorable intermediate and unfavorable intermediate, and then coming on to high risk, where these people do metastasis if you follow them up. So as far as the whole management of a localized prostate cancer is concerned, so especially in the high risk group where I was trying to say you T3 and above, or if there is node positivity or the PSA is more than 20 or Gleason's more than 7, in that subgroup of patients we need to do a staging, because we need to see what is the spread of disease. So there has been a randomized controlled trial comparing PSMA PET-CT versus CT scan plus bone scan. So in this particular trial, what they have included is high risk prostate cancer patients who are amenable for radical therapy, and they use the gallium-68 PSMA PET-CT. So this was a randomized controlled trial of 300 patients. So this particular trial showed that PSMA PET-CT is more sensitive and more specific, and it can change treatment in nearly half of them. So this is the evidence that we have in favor of PSMA PET-CT. So we usually have less PET-CT evidence in oncology. We usually follow the good old CT scan and bone scan. So we need to use PSMA PET-CT if available. So Dr. Abhay or Dr. Rajesh, can you just pitch in and say, so how often you feel that PSMA PET-CT must be done before offering radical therapy is localized? Dr. Abhay, Dr. Rajesh, anybody? Dr. Rajesh, you have not unmuted. You unmute and speak.
Yes, I was unmuted.
PSMA PET scan must be done unless the patient is too sick for this. In all other cases, the PSMA PET-CT must be done before embarking upon the treatment. Okay, so are you not happy with the CT scan and the bone scan?
No, not at all. In many cases, after PSMA PET-CT, what we initially thought to be localized disease, it turned out to be metastatic disease, or lymph node involvement can be seen. So PSMA PET CT is more specific, more sensitive, and it many a time it changes the treatment plan.
Okay. Okay. Dr. Abhay, any take on this? Supposing you have a resource constraint setting, how do you go about it?
Yeah, I mean, completely agree with Rajesh. Whenever you're planning radical treatment, like radiation therapy, staging is most important because it changes depending on how sensitive the investigation modality is there. And I mean, all these data, I mean, clearly there is evidence to show PSA PET scan is more sensitive, more specific of the specific lesions. So I feel and I believe, and in my practice also I do PET scans, PSA PET scans for all the patients of localized prostate cancer, which we are considering treatment. For maybe metastatic prostate cancers or very high prostate, I mean, PSA levels, and when you think lesions should be picked up on CT scan and bone scan, and the treatment is not going to change, then on those cases, and if the patient is not really affording, because this cost around 25,000 rupees, so we can avoid the PET scans and do bone scans and CT scan, because we are going to save around 12,000 rupees by doing that. But for the rest of all the patients, we do routinely PSA PET scans.
So that's a very good point what Dr. Abhay made. So we should not keep doing PSMA PET scan serially to see what is the response. I gave 3 cycles of chemotherapy and I did PET scan. What is the response? Is it partial response? So hardly it matters. So it's only this particular indication is very strong and it is indicated only in that subgroup of high risk patients where my treatment will change if I do. So otherwise, just doing PSMA PET CT to find out response is not at all recommended. So we need to have a judicious use of these sensitive and effective investigations when they have any influence in treatment. So that's the point what I wanted to make. So then coming on to the role of adjuvant ADT in the unfavorable intermediate risk group. So we just had a talk as to what is the difference between favorable and unfavorable Gleason's 3+4 and 4+3. So we have 2 large randomized controlled trials as far as adjuvant ADT in the unfavorable. This is basically post definitive RT, and this is not in the post-op setting. So we did have a trial where they compared 6 months of Zoladex versus observation, and the biochemical failure was better, and the disease-free survival at 10 years was better, and there was no OS difference. So so this is about adjuvant ADT where we use. So we can see the molecule what we use here is goserelin, and we don't have leprolide, we don't have other molecules basically present in the adjuvant or in the curative setting. Leave apart the palliative setting, but in the curative setting we have only Zoladex. The randomized trials have mainly used Zoladex as the option. So then going on to that in the high risk where T3 and above, Gleason's 8, and you have a high PSA of more than 20. Then in that subgroup of patients where we give post definitive RT, we have 3 large randomized controlled trials where they have compared Zoladex for 3 years was observation, and then even here there has been a significant disease-free survival and overall survival benefit if you use adjuvant androgen deprivation therapy. Again, the molecule here is Zoladex using goserelin and not leprolide or not triptorelin. The strong evidence is with goserelin only. And then, so this is the curves that say that ADT has survival benefit. And again, at least 4 to 6 months in the unfavorable intermediate group, whereas in the high risk group, we have to give at least 18 months of Zoladex post radical RT, and this is not post surgery. So this is the 10-year results showing significant progression-free survival difference, and this is the recommendations, very strong recommendations post definitive RT, and strong recommendations even in the locally advanced disease. So well, Dr. Rajesh, maybe you can say, so we don't have this adjuvant androgen deprivation therapy in post definitive surgery setting. We have it only in the setting of post RT. So
Yes.
why do you think this sort of a subtle difference is there? Is RT not sufficient enough to eradicate, or what is the what do you think is the idea? Or in any condition, where do you offer adjuvant androgen deprivation therapy post surgery also?
We do offer if the PSA is still high after surgery. If the
Okay.
PSA is still high, if the PSA touches the bottom line, usually the PSA is undetectable, 0.0 in go, 0.00 in range. But if the
Okay.
PSA is high, then we go for adjuvant androgen deprivation therapy.
Okay. So, Dr. Abhay, what is your take on whether we have evidence only for Zoladex in the adjuvant setting? We don't have evidence for Digarelix. We don't have evidence for Leuprolide. So, what is your take on using other molecules other than Zoladex, even though we don't have evidence? It's a very subtle question, but we don't have evidence. That is the biggest thing. So, what do you think using them in this setting? And why do you think post radiotherapy we have, but post surgery we don't even speak of ADT if the PSA touch normalcy?
You know,
what are your thoughts on it?
surgery and radiation are two different treatment modalities. You know, when you have done the surgery, you have got the specimen. You know that you have removed the complete tumor. You know the exact biology, because sometimes the pathology changes from the initial crooked biopsies to the final histopathology that we get after.
Yes.
And on those scenario, you are almost certain that you are. I mean, and on follow-up scans, you have seen the PSA is been undetectable. Then almost you are sure that you are. I mean, you have completely cured the cancer, right? Well, during radiation therapy, you are not sure of the pathology. You are not sure. Because PSA is not a very good marker after radiation therapy. It may fluctuate and whether it is waxing, waning, and so there is no good marker. And adjuvant before hormone radiation therapy, the adjuvant hormone therapy is given to decrease the prostate volume to make it a better target for radiation therapy. And in the post RT settings, you know, it's a combination therapy of hormone plus RT. It's never like RT alone. But in surgery, hormone therapy in adjuvant setting is given in only those cases where we find that patient will require adjuvant or salvage radiation therapy later on, or if there is a node positive disease and we think the metastatic disease and should be treated like a metastatic disease rather than a localized disease. In those settings, hormone therapy should be given. And the question that whether Zoladex or other, LHRH agonist or antagonist, I'm not sure. We are using, all of them, all of them. Not only Zoladex. Yeah, thank you.
So you don't have any preference to using Zoladex in the curative setting,
yeah.
Or it's okay, I can use Leuprolide also, because the evidence is that. I was just figuring out that is the biggest way of portraying the molecule in the present day. There are multiple ways of promoting a molecule. Some say soft gelatin capsule, some say hard gelatin capsule. So there are multiple ways of marketing a molecule. So to look strictly, see, Leuprolide and there has been no comparison in the adjuvant setting. There has been comparison only in the palliative setting. The meta-analysis says all of them are equivalent.
There is no head-to-head trial.
Yeah. So I don't know. Digarelix, maybe they have to come up and show. They can show possible. So, but as of now, so the take-home message is we have only Zoladex being approved in the adjuvant setting. And we don't have any other molecules approved. So, and this is one more thing what we cannot ignore is the adjuvant ADT for 1.5 to 2 years is not easy, because these patients are not going to die. They're going to live long and they want a good quality of life. So ADT, if you give for 1.5 to 2 years, whatever Leuprolide, whatever Zoladex you give, for these set of patients, the testosterone may not return back to normal even after you stopping in some select subgroup of patients. So they may have problems in the sexual life and all these issues. So the quality of life when it comes post-adjuvant, post-radical RT, and then you're giving androgen deprivation therapy for 2 years, and you will have erectile dysfunction even after you complete the definitive therapy, and he's going to live, because these patients are not, if you treat with radical intent, they're not going to die, they're going to live long. So their quality of life is hampered. So what is your take on it? Maybe Dr. Rajesh can say. So we know in surgery there is no need of adjuvant ADT if your PSA is normalized. But if you do a RT, I want to give for some 6 months, 2 years, 3 years. There's a lot of debate on the duration depending on whatever risk factor. So how difficult is this adjuvant ADT in a patient who's going to live at least for 10-20 years? Is going to live now if he's cured?
Patients are very unhappy with the side effect of adjuvant ADT. There is no doubt about it. They have problem they gain weight, they have problem with the sexual life, they have more prone to fractures. They are facing the problem like hot flush and like all these things. So basically, we counsel them regarding that these will go away once we stop the ADT. And not much can be done about these symptoms.
Exactly. So, but it does cause quality of.
Yes. Patients are very concerned and they are very distressed, particularly for the sexual reasons and for the weight gain. Two very important side effects of ADT.
Exactly. So, Dr. Abhay, there are some instances where we have seen a locally advanced prostate cancer, and the surgeon, what he does, all is bilateral orchidectomy and send the patients home. So, what is your? There are a few DNB students. There are a few postgraduate students who are there. So, what is your message to those where a patient has a locally advanced prostate cancer and prostate is not addressed, they address with bilateral orchidectomy, and then they send the patient home with symptomatic benefit. So, what is this practice and why is it still existing even in the current era?
Yeah, I mean that's true picture actually, and sad as well. Because many times you see patients with localized prostate cancer getting orchidectomy done. So you see, the treatment is done depending on the clinical situation and also the socio-economic condition of the patient in our setup. Okay. Scientifically speaking, bilateral orchidectomy should not be done for localized prostate cancer or locally advanced prostate cancer. Maybe a short-term hormone therapy plus radiation therapy is a good option for them. Because obviously, long-term, lifelong hormone therapy has got its own disadvantages. People don't talk much about sexual function, but yeah, they definitely talk about the weight gain and hot flashes. And hot flashes is very, very difficult and challenging problem to be addressed. Very difficult because we don't have much of a drug or treatment modalities. So, and testosterone level, because of decreased testosterone, there is other like loss of muscle mass, loss of bone mass, weakness, and these are the problems which are there. So lifelong hormone therapy. But of course, if the patient is not affording or it comes from very poor socioeconomic status, so still I see. I mean, my teachers doing orchidectomy, and they have reason for it. But if you ask me, should be done? My answer is should not be done. Bilateral should not be done for a localized or locally advanced prostate cancer. Thank you.
Okay, so again, if you look into the socio-economic status and the patient it cannot afford for radical intent prostatic therapy, then in those select subgroup of patients, offering orchidectomy is a reasonable option because he will never take ADT, he will never come for radical RT for the prostate, radical prostate he cannot afford. So definitely these subgroup of patients, maybe we can select them for, again, it's a case to case and not in a scientific platform, but this happens in practice. And it is not completely wrong if you look into the socioeconomic status. So that is what we can understand. Okay, so this is about then coming on to the metastatic hormone sensitive prostate cancer. So the initial ADT, what we used to give was diethyl stilbestrol, or even nowadays we give these drugs in the metastatic setting like Honavin and all this, where they do effectively work. And the way it works is by it inhibits the GnRH release from the hypothalamus, but the problem is it has high cardiovascular mortality. Orchidectomy.
Yes.
So orchidectomy, there was a trial where they in West they explained the pros and cons of medical versus surgical castration, and in that particular trial, 22% of them chose orchidectomy as an option, even if they were affording, even if they were insured. 22% still chose surgical orchidectomy upfront. And there is something called subcapsular orchidectomy where I can preserve my the psychological feeling, the testes are there, and with an intact androgen deprivation. So, Dr. Rajesh, what is your opinion on what percentage of patients you see in practice go ahead with surgical orchidectomy, and what percentage are okay with a medical androgen deprivation therapy?
In India, more than 50% will choose orchidectomy for two reasons. One is a one-time treatment; they won't have to come again and again for these injections. Second is a much more cheaper. For this reason, most of more than 50% in India will choose orchidectomy. But nowadays, the percentage of medical castration is rising because the patients are more aware about it. So
we can, so now with 50%, something around 40%, or
so still
you start
50,
with the
at least
medical
50.
androgen deprivation, and then as the time goes, then later on they
Yes,
change
yes. Most
themselves
of the
to.
patient they start with the medical ADT. Later on, with they realize that this is a recurring expense, so they choose the surgical orchidectomy, surgical option.
Okay. Dr. Abhay, what is your take on this subcapsular orchidectomy, and are we practicing it really?
Yeah, there are two things I would like to make comment. The practice, your first question, I mean, the practice regarding the injections versus orthotomy. The practice is changing nowadays and changing rapidly, I must say. There are two or three factors there. One is because of decreasing cost of the drugs. Earlier, they were prohibitively high cost. Now, the cost have significantly come down. So, more and more people are now choosing for injections rather than surgery. Second is the insurance coverage. A lot of people are now covered under various schemes and various insurance schemes. So now, because the cost is covered, so they don't want surgery, and now they are going for injections. So as I say, always the treatment is, two-way communication between the patient and the doctor. We say they both are the equally effective. What do you choose? You got surgery because of cost constraints, or if you want the one-time solution because you don't want 3 monthly injections, or if you feel the patient is coming from far places and maybe he will not come again for follow-up for injections, maybe otherwise, more and more people are now going for injections therapies. And regarding the surgeries, subcapsular and totalectomy, there were few reasons for doing subcapsular. One was psychological thing that the patient will feel that he has still got his balls, and maybe he'll have better psychological backup. And but what we felt while we were on training days, that many times during subcapsulotomy, few parenchyma or testis was left behind, and when the PSA starts rising, you feel the testis, something is there, still there, and you're not sure whether all the testis has been removed or not. And then you check for the biopsy, and then you check for okay, what is the testosterone level. So there is a lot of confusion, a lot of complications regarding subcapsular. And in our practice, we have seen there is not much of psychological difference between the subcapsular and the protolectomy. So I don't feel that's some significant difference in psychological aspect regarding subcapsular and totalectomy. So in our practice, we are doing totalectomy. We are not doing subcapsular.
So, well, subcapsular is more of a textbook thing and a theoretical thing than actual practice, especially in our setting.
Yes.
Going further, if we have the range of GnRH agonists which we have, so basically these are having 100 times more affinity to the GnRH receptors than the natural GnRH. So we had buserelin, where it has also a nasal preparation. We have goserelin, the Zoladex which we are speaking today, the triptorelin that we have, and then leprolide. So these are the molecules that we have in market, and we would want to target a testosterone of less than 50, and if you have an orchidectomy, the levels are less than 20. So that is what we want to target. So there have been studies where the lesser the levels of testosterone, the better the benefit is. So if you do this medical GnRH agonist therapy, you can achieve this castrate levels of testosterone in a matter of 3 to 4 weeks. So it doesn't happen in one day. So the symptoms may initially increase and then followed by reduction in symptoms. So it makes logical to prevent that initial flare combining with bicalutamide or an androgen blocker. So this is about the GnRH agonists which we have. Dr. Rajesh, you want to make any comment on which molecule? How do you choose? What are the deciding factors like frequency, dose, side effects, cost? Multiple factors are there, and do you routinely combine bicalutamide with these? So, what is your take on these? How do you choose which?
I will routinely combine bicalutamide with the GnRH agonist. And the patient who can afford Degarelix, for them it's not necessary. But with the patient who are taking GnRH agonist, for them I will routinely combine bicalutamide. Second thing is, in our country, the main factor is the cost. Patients who are covered under any insurance or scheme, for them, the routine frequency of injection or cost doesn't matter. But the patient who are paying out of their own pocket, for them, they will want the cheaper option. And this is the reason the most of these patients will choose orchidectomy. The patient who are covered by the insurance or under some scheme, they will always choose medical treatment. And they don't have, basically, they don't,
Rajesh, you muted. You got muted. Yeah. Yeah. Hello. So you're able to hear? Dr. Rajesh, you can hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. So that's what. So you were saying. So cost is a factor where what we need to do. So once you start this medical androgen deprivation, Dr. Rabha, you can take. So do you monitor these testosterone levels? How often you monitor, or it's fine? We can take it that if the patient is taking injections, we don't monitor. So what is your take on monitoring testosterone levels when the patient is on medical androgen deprivation?
See, the patient is responding. If the PSA is responding, then usually you don't do routine testosterone level follow-up. But yeah, if the patient is on injections and the PSA is not responding, then we first check the testosterone level, whether the injections are effective or not effective before changing the line of treatment.
So then, so coming on further, if we have a comparison of GnRH agonist versus orchidectomy, there is a meta-analysis of more than 2,000 patients where both of them are equivalent in PFS and OS, and there is no difference between leuprolide, glucerin, and buserelin in this meta-analysis. Then we have this intermittent versus continuous ADT. So there has been big randomized controlled trials of around 1,500 patients. Can you mute Muthu?
Sir, I'm doing, sir.
Yeah. Find out from where it's happening.
Done, sir.
Okay. Okay, fine. So, so if you have intermittent versus continuous androgen deprivation therapy, so what we do in intermittent is we give medical androgen deprivation once they are touched normalcy, then we wait until the PSA becomes more than 20, and then we intervene. So in that particular trial, what it showed was it was a big trial of around 1,500 patients. And there the median OS difference was significant, 5.1 versus 5.8 years overall survival. But however, in that subgroup where the intermittent arm was there, they had a better quality of life. So in any place, Dr. Rajesh, you can answer, you can unmute and answer. So do you practice intermittent androgen deprivation therapy? Is there any room in any place? What do you say? You can unmute, you unmute and speak. Did you unmute? Yeah.
I don't practice.
Again, it went into mute. Muthu, you can look into it. Why is it going into mute?
I don't practice intermittent ADT. I think it's a suboptimal treatment.
Okay. What about this? There are theories saying that if you give intermittent ADT, the disease, they become more androgen sensitive, plus the quality of life is also better. So, but the overall survival is different. So, is there any room where you can use in that low subgroup, or low group, low risk group, or whatever? So, in practice, can we adopt this, or it's out of question?
Lower risk group, I think surveillance will be okay. I don't think I am not a fan of intermittent ADT.
Now you take metastatic setting.
Metastatic, okay. Intermittent, I think a suboptimal treatment.
Okay.
I personally do not prefer doing intermittent ADT.
Okay, Dr. Abhay, do you practice at any point of time?
Not in metastatic settings. Yeah, we have used and we are using sometimes in post-radical post-radical patients who are on androgen deprivation therapy, and the PSA response is very good. And patient is sensitive that we can, give him some androgen-free period, and then see the PSA response. Then again restart the. So we are practicing some post-radical patients who have positive margins, or the patient have received adjuvant or salvage radiation therapy in some time settings. Otherwise, in metastatic, we usually don't practice intermittent therapy.
Exactly. So it has inferior survival, not the standard of care. In select subgroup, non-metastatic, we can practice. This is the comparison of Digarelix versus Leuprolide. 600 patients, randomized controlled trial. PSA progression was better and local site reactions were 40%, staggering. So the problem with Digarelix is more frequent, costly, and injection site reactions. So if a patient is affording, cost is not a problem. In metastatic setting, Digarelix should be given for all patients if cost is a problem. So what do you think, Abhay? You feel we should give Digarelix for all patients who can afford? I'm okay with anything. What do you say? Cost is not a factor.
Definitely, if the patient can afford, and the monthly injections coming to the hospital or healthcare facility, or if he can arrange the injections at home, and monthly injection not a constraint for him, maybe then Digarelix is a preferred options for me. I usually prescribe Digarelix.
Okay, Dr. Rajesh, you feel any challenges of giving Digarelix in your practice? Injection site reactions, frequency.
That is there. Second is a costly. Cost is a factor. So I personally, if patient is having cardiac issues, then I definitely prefer the Digarelix. Otherwise, I give them the choice between the Digarelix or Zoladex or Leuprolide, whatever they choose.
Correct. So the biggest advantage of Digarelix is the cardiac. So patient has a known cardiac problem, then we should force them to go for Digarelix. Exactly. So then androgen monotherapy, like giving only bicalutamide for metastatic prostate cancer, is not a correct option. A shorter OS when compared to ADT, and then comes ADT plus systemic therapy. So these are what we have in the hormone sensitive setting. We have every molecule now coming on into the castrate sensitive setting. We have abiraterone, where we use latitude trial, stampede trial. We have docetaxel, started stampede. We have apalutamide in Titan trial. We have enzalutamide in Enzamet and Archis trial. So there are multiple trials. There are at least 2 to 3 randomized trials for each molecule, and there is no head-to-head comparison, and it is very unlikely we will have also. So, and there are trials where they have tried to combine enzalutamide plus docetaxel. It has increased toxicity, but it has not improved survival. So it is sequential use of these drugs, and they are very subtle molecules. There are not much differences. If you look into the overall survival cross-trial comparison, not much difference. So choice is a problem at all. So if you look into docetaxel has benefited only in the high disease burden group, where Gleason's is high, more than 4 bone metastasis, visceral metastasis, high nodal burden, PSA is high. So in that subgroup, docetaxel has shown a overall survival benefit. Abiraterone also prefers more of a high disease burden subgroup. Apalutamide and enzalutamide have shown but the short-term data, not much data. Apalutamide is not available as of now. Enzalutamide in Arches has shown benefit both in low disease burden and high disease burden. So, Dr. Rajesh, what do you think? If a patient of metastatic castrate-sensitive prostate cancer is with you, how do you look into the prospect? So ADT is not enough, that we know. We need to add something to ADT to improve overall survival. So how do you choose, and what do you prefer to choose in this setting?
The patient who are having very high volume disease to begin with, or the patient is very young who require the aggressive therapy. In these two cases, in these two scenarios, I will prefer the combination of either docetaxel or abiraterone to begin with.
Okay. Okay. So how confident? Maybe Abhay can take this question. So how confident you giving abiraterone or enzalutamide for a hormone-sensitive prostate cancer? You're muted it. You can unmute it, Abhay. You're there. Yeah.
So, Chandrakant, in this scenario, metastatic hormone-sensitive prostate cancers, depending on whether the patient is fit for chemotherapy and how big is the disease volume, right? To decide the therapies. If it's a chemo-fit patient, high disease volume, definitely will go for hormone plus chemotherapy. The patient is not fit for chemo, abiraterone, enzalutamide, depending on other factors, or having more bone disease, then maybe if he has any liver issues, then maybe you can avoid abiraterone. So otherwise, there is hardly to choose between in cases of chemo unfit. For chemo fit patient, there is no doubt about sequencing in them. In unfit patients, abiraterone, if the LFT is good, you can prescribe. Otherwise, enzalutamide is also a good option. So basically, it's a cost factor, and because enzalutamide is still, costlier because a month therapy around 40,000 rupees. Like any means, while abiraterone is around 10-12,000 rupees. And if the patient is going to start this medicine, then take it for long period of time till he has got the response from these drugs. So it's a difficult decision to make from the patient's point of view. But I mean, well opted.
Okay, so that is the way. So we choose it not depending on efficacy, but depending on the toxicity profile and multiple other factors. So just quickly running through the data, this is a latitude study that showed overall survival benefit with abiraterone. This is the Stampede data. In Stampede data, they included non-metastatic hormone-sensitive prostate cancer. Nearly 50% patients were non-metastatic. Even they had N0 disease also. And even in the non-metastatic setting, there was an overall survival benefit with a hazard ratio of 0.75. Dr. Rajesh, what do you think giving abiraterone to a non-metastatic, high-risk, locally advanced prostate cancer, T4N0, T3N1, Gleason's high, PSA 40, do you follow this? Stampede trial says that the hazard ratio is 75. There is 25% reduction in the risk of death. So what do you think? We should follow this?
I think we need more studies. This should be done in under a trial setting only, not outside the trial setting. This
we
cannot be
we have a randomized trial with us saying that the hazard ratio is 0.75 even in the non-metastatic setting. This is the only trial with abiraterone we have. I agree with you. The other trials
I think
have
this topic is still controversial in the non-metastatic group. There are a lot of controversy around this trial also. So better we should wait for more trials. Till then, we should continue our usual practice.
Okay, Dr. Abhay, you want to add anything as far as the locally advanced, high-risk, non-metastatic? You want to use systemic therapy or not?
Not in practice.
Okay. So proceeding further, low-dose abiraterone. Abhay, do you practice low-dose abiraterone, 250 milligram, one tablet with low-fat diet?
No. Actually, initially, there was a lot of question and a lot of interest on this topic because fatty food increase the absorption, and so maybe we can decrease the amount of the fatty diet. But I don't know how much clinically it is and how much it translates into effect of the PSA response and all that. So, and
okay. So fair enough. So quickly running through the data, this is network meta-analysis that said that enzalutamide is better than docetaxel in OS in low volume disease, and enza and apalutamide have better side effect profile. This is the recent data which I can present you, and this is the questions we would answer. How long to give ADT with EBRT? We give ADT for if it is a low risk, then we will give ADT for 6 months. If it is low intermediate, in the high risk, we will give it for 1.5 years. ADT plus docetaxel, yes, we give in the high metastatic disease burden disease. ADT plus abiraterone, we give both in low disease burden, high disease burden, and enzalutamide is also an option. So in CRPC, what we need to understand is we need to continue androgen deprivation therapy even if the patient becomes castrate resistant. and he should not stop ADT the moment he becomes CRPC. So once a patient is metastatic, should receive androgen deprivation for long. So there are a lot of issues where the patient becomes castrate resistant and we miss on ADT. This problem is there. So we need to ensure continuing ADT. So this is the questions which we answered. And there is something called local treatment in metastatic disease. So if I have a metastatic low disease burden disease, I can give local radiotherapy. So there has been a randomized trial where it showed giving local radiotherapy in a metastatic disease improves survival. So just quickly running through the data, this is the duration of ADT. The comparison was between 18 and 36 months. 36 months had poor quality of life. 18 months was good enough even in the high risk setting. So quality of life was definitely better if you could give for 1.5 years. And then 18 months ADT is standard of care, and docetaxel started trial. What it showed was if you had a high disease burden, docetaxel improved survival, but not in the low disease burden group. This is in the low disease burden where there is no improvement in survival. And then this is a charted conclusion said that you need the overall survival difference is quite significant in the high metastatic burden disease. And then we don't use zoledronic acid in the hormone sensitive setting. We use it only in the castrate resistant prostate cancer. We avoid bisphosphonates in the hormone sensitive setting. So this is about quickly running the abiraterone. We have finished already. This is the trials which we had. It did show PFS and overall survival. This is latitude final analysis where we are reaching a survival of around 5 to 6 years in a patient with metastatic prostate cancer. And enzalutamide, the ARCHES trial, updated analysis showed that it is beneficial both in low disease and high disease burden. Looks to be very competent and more effective than abiraterone. But we don't have it's a cross-trial comparison. We don't have a head-to-head comparison. And then coming on to, so we need to continue androgen deprivation therapy even if it is castrate resistant. So enzalutamide differs from bicalutamide in that it not only inhibits the receptor, it also gets into the cell, inhibits the internalization, inhibits the translocation and all that. So to conclude, so local treatment in metastatic disease, yes, there is a benefit if there is low metastatic burden. So then finally, so we answered how long to give ADT in a high risk, 18 months. Metastatic in metastatic carcinoma of prostate, ADT plus docetaxel in high volume metastatic disease. Abiraterone can be given, enzalutamide can be given. In CRPC, we need to continue androgen deprivation therapy, and enzalutamide also can be given. So local treatment, if there is low disease burden, we can give. So with this, I would conclude. Zoladex is the only one that has got approval in the curative or in the adjuvant setting. We don't have other molecules being approved, and Zoladex has its role both in the adjuvant and also in the metastatic setting as well. So this is how the injection looks like, very user friendly, and that's all about it. Thank you. So whatever, Rajesh and Rabha, you want to add something? Any take home messages? Or
Amarkant, I thought you will be sharing something about how the practice has changed in prostate cancer during this corona pandemic.
okay, that's a beautiful. You can. Yeah, that's a very. So what do you think? How do we handle prostate cancer in this COVID era?
Yeah, I mean surgically up to when the patient remains with us, lot of things have changed. First thing is biopsy. Normally is there, so I'll just share his.
A very bad experience.
Biopsy should not be done in this time. When you suspect PSA is around 10 or so, then biopsy can be safely avoided for next 6 months. And in other clinical scenario, when you feel the patient has thousands like and he has got symptoms, then only you can do biopsy. Otherwise, even in those scenarios also, you can directly start treatment without doing a prostate biopsy. Because biopsy is not a small procedure; it has got its own complications and should be avoided. And hematuria retention are possible, and they are there. So we have seen.
And another thing I should add, biopsy should be done by the urosurgeon only. I'm sorry, but that is also take home message from my side.
Yeah.
And more of docetaxel, less of docetaxel and more of abiraterone and
Exactly.
enzalutamide, so that patient can
Exactly.
avoid the hospital admission.
Correct. Perfect. So
So
that is what. So yeah,
chemotherapy
correct.
should be avoided whenever possible. I mean, like when the patient is having metastatic hormone sensitive prostate cancer, and you are going to start hormone plus chemotherapy, and this scenario, maybe I feel it should be avoided when you can, and when it's absolutely necessary, then you have to obviously give it. But chemotherapy in those scenarios can be avoided. This is like
So what you are saying is in congruence with the guidelines of ESMO and ASCO, where you have to change from injectable to oral therapy whenever possible, even if there is a mild reduction in outcome. So I think it's a reasonable option, and you're spot on in the COVID era. I think it would have been incomplete if we wouldn't have put COVID in place. So thanks Abhay for that, and thanks Rajesh and Devaldo for your precious time. You drove car and you reached home. Thank you so much for you. I think Devaldo's words were so precious today of Gleason's 3+4 and 4+3. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you, Astra, for this opportunity. Okay, over to you, Devesh.
Just one thing. Hello, Chandrakant.
Yeah, continue.
See, I have just recently, I have one patient of very known patient of prostate cancer. As all of you are there, medical oncology, radiation oncology, surgical oncology, that's I just discussed the case. The patient is a 69 years old male. Apparently, he's a healthy, but suddenly he had the sharp back pain, and PSA was 695 at the time. Okay. So, when the prostate biopsy was done here in Arantagar Hospital, basically it shows that it is a 5+4. More than 85% cohorts are involved by tumors. There are extensive PNI. There is no small cell carcinoma component is there. And the morphological features suggest that they are basically that ETS family of transcription fusions, and the chance of the androgen sensitivity also there. So extraprostatic extension I cannot comment because there is no extraprostatic tissue was there. So it is a 5+4, 85% involvement, extensive PNI, IDCP was there, high grade PIN was there, and PSA is 695. So what should be the next line of management?
Abhay?
Demal, he has got symptoms, right? He has got a back
Yes,
pain.
yes.
He has a backache. Just one thing I just add.
695.
695. PSA is
Yeah,
695.
itself is a metastatic, is a representative of
HRCT chest was done, and HRCT chest was no meds, and the just X-ray, simple X-ray of the LF spine was done by the radiologist here, and that shows the spondylolisthesis, no gross meds. So what should be the next step for this patient?
Should be treated like a metastatic.
Yes.
HRCT chest was done to rule out COVID, not for metastatic disease.
Yes.
So,
This is a metastatic disease. We have to treat like that only.
You do a staging bone scan or a CT scan you need to do, and then you should start on ADT. You should use Zoladex plus
So he
abiraterone.
should go for the PSMA PET scan or the bone scan?
Yeah.
Chandrakant, this is
PSMA
an important question. Whether he should go for a PSMA PET scan in this COVID time, or
think-
we start the treatment without doing any further staging.
First, give him no PSMA PET CT. First, give him ADT. Okay, ADT is the first step, and then we will see we will debate what we need to do. First, we should start him on androgen deprivation therapy right now. Bicalutamide and androgen deprivation therapy. If you are giving agonist,
I think this patient needs DRLX.
Yeah, I agree with you.
There might be impending cord compression or like that. Your patient is having back pain.
Possible.
Yeah.
I think it's better to give him DRLX.
Give him ADT first, and then we will plan what to investigate. Bone scan, CT scan, we will debate later. Okay. So, thanks, Devaldo.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Devesh, you're there?
Yeah, thank you so much, Doctor, for this. It was a really interesting discussion. I was also enjoying and trying to learn a bit on the science piece also as well. Thank you so much to each and every doctor for attending this, taking their valuable time out, even in this difficult situation, and keeping the science on the front foot. I really wanted to appreciate the efforts which each and every doctor is putting in this difficult situation to fight out the COVID situation also from the entire organization. Gratitudes are there to each and every doctor from our side, sir. Thank you so much for this interesting discussion. We will definitely continue this kind of discussion in terms of supporting the Zoom platform and the PPT. Thank you so much, Doctor.
Thank you so much. Thank you.